Chapter 24. Andy and Bueller. Anne and Noah are patiently waiting in line inside the restaurant as they stood right in front of the lobby. Anne looks at Noah and starts smiling at her. Noah doesn't notice him smiling, as she is looking right in front of her, where there is a couple wearing high-priced outfits. The man is wearing a velvet suit and tie, while the lady is wearing a leopard fur coat. The well-dressed couple is done with their wait and is about to go inside the dining room. Anne and Noah are next to them, right behind that couple. Now, once that couple is inside, there is just a host standing in front of them who is wearing oval spectacles. The host is standing on a valet stand, greeting the well-dressed couple as they make their way inside. The host says to the well-dressed couple, "Right this way and thank you." Once the couple is inside, the host looks at Anne and Noah. With an apologetic look in his eyes that lasted only for a few seconds, he smiles and says, "Hello, welcome to the Sheepdog restaurant. We are currently full right now." Noah looks at the host and thinks that he must have made a mistake as she says, "But I have a reservation." The host looks at her and asks, "Really? What's your last name, miss?" The host opens his guest book and looks inside, as Noah says, "Grain." The host keeps looking at his guest book while chanting, "Grain, grain, grain, grain. Ah, here you are." With that being said, the host closes the guest book and says, "Right this way." Noah looks at him, weirdly, and says, "Thanks." Anne and Noah are just about to go inside when the host calls out, "Excuse me, sir?" Anne and Noah's steps halt right then and there, as Anne turns his head around to look back at the host. He looks at the host and asks, Yes?" The host looks at Anne's face. Then, with a furrowed brows, he says, "You can't go therein without shoes." Anne looks down at his feet, where the host's gaze is already. He then looks up at the host again as he says, "They're shoes." The host shakes his head slightly and says, "No, they are not. They are socks." Anne shrugs before responding, "Their new style of shoes." The host looks at Anne, then back at his feet, as he skeptically asks, "What are they called?" Anne looks taken aback as he tries to form a sentence. He thinks for a second, then responds, "I don't know what they're called, but I just got them today. They're supposed to look like socks." The host is still looking at Anne's feet. Finally, after staring at his feet intently for some time, he goes up to Anne and says, "Would you mind if I go on my knees to check and touch your shoes?" Noah gets riled up at this statement, as he says with frustration, "This is ridiculous. Just let us in." The host reasons with Noah, being as polite as he can as he says, "I just want to make sure that he's telling the truth, Miss Grain." Noah rolls her eyes before shaking her head as she says, "All right, we'll just leave." Before Noah could turn around and actually leave, the host immediately calls out, "Wait, Miss Grain." Noah stops in her tracks and looks at the host, who looks apologetic while saying, "My apologies if my tactics threatened you. I allow you to come inside the dining room." Noah huffs and says, "All right, thank you." The host responds, "You're welcome. But sir, may I suggest you change your outfit? We can give you something to wear to make you appear even more intriguing." Anne looks at Noah as he says, "I'll meet you inside." Noah nods and smiles at him before saying, "Okay." With one last look, Noah goes inside the dining room while Anne is shown the door behind him by the host, as he says, "Go inside that room, across from you." Anne gives a half smile and says, "Thanks." The host responds, "You're welcome." Anne goes towards that door, as he quickly opens and closes the door behind him. Inside the room, Anne couldn't see anything, since the room is pitch black. Someone is touching the walls. Anne tries to search for a source of light as he whispers to himself, "Where's the switch?" Anne soon hears the sound of footsteps walking around the room, then the dangling sound of a skinny string. He tries looking here and there as he whispers out loud, "Huh, what's this?" Then he hears the sounds of someone pulling down the string as the host's voice comes out suddenly, saying, "Did you find the clothes, sir?" Suddenly, all the lights in the room come to life. This spooked Anne a bit as he turns around to look who it is. Anne exclaims, "Holy shy! I mean, you got me startled, sir." The host apologizes and says, "My apologies, sir. Did you find the clothes?" Anne looks around the room, and with confusion marred at his face, he says, "I don't see any clothes." The host points somewhere as he says, "Look behind your right side." Anne turns around and looks down to see a cardboard box that has a label with "Lost and Found" written on it. Anne stares at it and says, "Oh." The door from which Anne had come inside is being opened once again. Only this time, he comes out from the door wearing a long black and white vertical striped dress shirt with slim black work pants and black lace shoes. Anne looks at the host as he says, "Thanks for giving me these shoes. They're pretty dope." The host is behind Anne as he's closing the door. Once he's done closing the door, he turns around and looks at Anne as he says, "You're welcome, and don't worry about the clothes, but the shoes will be on your bill." Anne gets quiet for a moment, while the host is back at his on the valet. He stands there and is again greeting Anne inside. The host informs Anne, "Miss Grain is in the booth with a portrait of a little orphan boy holding a black balloon." Anne says, "Okay, thanks." He then mutters under his breath, "Creep." The host has apparently listened to him as he says, "Pardon me?" Anne looks up at him as he says, "Huh?" "I didn't say anything." The host looks at Anne with narrowed eyes as he says, "You said creep." Under your breath. Anne is still for a moment. He then looks at the host apologetically and says, "I'm sorry, The host says, "Just go to your table." Anne stays quiet for a moment. Then, all of a sudden, he smiles as if nothing happened just a moment ago and goes inside the dining room. He looks around the dining room that is dimly bright with lights all around. The walls are colored in a dark brown shade, while the floors are covered with Bueller carpet. On Anne's left, he can see round tables covered with fabric tablecloths and fully organized with shiny silverware. Anne looks around and finally notices Noah. He looks at her and smiles while she is sitting and waiting on the left side of the table inside their reserved booth. On the wall, in the middle of the booth, there is a portrait of a sad little boy holding a black balloon, wearing a black flat hat, dark blue jacket, and a white button-up shirt covered with a dark gray vest, dark blue shorts, and brown sandals. Anne sits down on the right side of the table inside the booth, and now he's facing Noah while he is still smiling at her. Anne asks Noah suddenly, "Did you order anything yet?" Noah looks up at Anne before responding, "No, I was waiting for you. You look good." Anne's smile stretches even more at the compliment as he says, "Thanks." Anne is yet again looking at Noah and is still smiling. He opens the menu card and starts reading whatever is written inside. He raises the menu card up till he covers his face with it, in an attempt to hide the nervousness that is pretty apparent at his face. After a moment, Anne's eyes peek up from behind the menu as he looks at Noah nervously. On the other hand, Noah is busy reading the menu attentively and has no idea of her surroundings or someone's gaze on her. The menu is placed flat on the table's surface, while her right fist is placed on her cheek as it rests on the fisted hand. After a while, she slowly looks up and directly into Anne's eyes, which are deeply gazing into her eyes, and she starts grinning at him. Anne's eyes go back down to the menu as he closes his eyes and starts inhaling deeply. Suddenly, he hears Bueller's voice saying, "Can I melt your face, fucker?" Anne gets startled and quickly opens his eyes while exclaiming, "What?" Anne puts his menu flat on the table and looks at Bueller. He comes back to his senses when he hears the waitress' voice as she asks, "I said, can I offer you a drink, sir?" Anne looks at the waitress and seems relieved. After composing himself, he says, "Oh yeah, can I get some water?" The waitress looks at him slightly perplexed before asking, "Sure." "What kind?" Anne looks at the waitress with confusion apparent at his face as he asks, "What kind?" "What do you mean?" The waitress informs him, There are different types of water here. It's on our menu. Anne picks up the menu and looks at it again. This time, he notices all the selections of water. He starts reading as he whispers, "Let's see." He starts whispering quietly, so that he is not heard by anyone else but himself. Fountain water, Filico water, ice water, Bling H2O river water, lake water, 100,000 BC water, capital water, hot water, miracle water, steam water, Locan Artes, mineral water, Aqua Deco water, cure water, mountain water, acid water, spring water, Kona Nagari water, fall water, winter water, Vian water, desert water, fine water, Tasmanland rainwater, Acqua di Cristallo, Tributo, a Modigliani water, and water with lemon. Anne doesn't know how long he was she reading the water menu, but as soon as he is done, he looks back up at the waitress and asks, "You don't have any tap water?" The waitress politely informs him, "No, we don't." Anne asks again, this time a bit more persistent, "You can't use the tap?" The waitress shakes her head and says again, "We can't do that." After contemplating for a moment, Anne finally asks, "Well, can I take water with lemon, please?" As soon as Anne places his choice of water, the waitress starts tapping on her tablet. Once she is done tapping, she looks up again, but this time her gaze is directed towards Noah. She looks back at the waitress and asks, "Can I have a Diet Grey Cola?" The waitress starts tapping on her tablet again. She looks up at both of them before asking, "Are you both ready to order?" Noah smiles at her and says, "I am ready." Noah looks at Anne along with the waitress. Anne gets the silent question, and he quickly answers, "I am no ready. Just give me a moment." The waitress says, "All right." Anne suddenly hears Bueller's voice coming out of the waitress's mouth, saying, "You fucking liar." Anne looks up at the waitress and asks, "What?" The waitress looks at Anne before responding, "I said, I'll be right back." The waitress walks away. Anne's left hand rubs his forehead as sweat starts appearing at it and slowly trickling down the side of his face, while Anne is still rubbing his forehead. Noah looks at him with concern and asks, "Are you all right?" Anne looks up at Noah before saying, "Huh?" "It's nothing. I'm just sweaty because of this creepy story I heard from this guy on the street today. It has really gotten to me." Noah asks, "Anne, really? What's the story about?" Anne gets a vision in front of his eyes that he and Bueller are walking on a sidewalk bridge while they are having a confrontation. He tries to explain the scenario to Noah, who is looking at him keenly, as he says, "The guy on the street told me that it was a story about a boy named Die and his friend Eller. They were walking on a bridge one day while talking about bets." Anne starts narrating the whole story. Bueller says, "You can't." Anne responds with confidence, laced in his tone, "Yes, I can." Bueller disagrees with him again, as he says, "You cannot." Anne replies furiously by saying, "Yes, I can, goddammit. I'll prove it to you." Anne and Bueller stop in the middle of the bridge when Anne continues saying, "If you don't think I can." He then pauses again and pulls out something from his right pants pocket before resuming his sentence. "Drop this pen and make it balanced on the LED?" Bueller shakes his head as he says, "There is no way." Anne say with triumph, "Okay, I bet you I can do it." Anne quickly looks down at the bridge on his right and says, "On that boat over there." Anne and Bueller are looking down, outside the bridge. A boat is crossing from under the bridge. Bueller looks at Anne as he asks, "What's the bet tricks?" Anne looks at Bueller as he says, "Put me on your list as a dishonest person." Bueller smiles while looking at Anne's face before saying, "Okay." Anne looks slightly relieved as he says, "Okay, cool. I'll show you that I'm a man of my word. You got your scope ready?" Bueller pulls out a small telescope from inside his jacket and is looking down at the bottom of the bridge. Bueller asks, "Ready?" Anne's right hand drops the pen suddenly, and the pen is now falling down towards the boat. They notice that the pen is landing and balancing itself on its lead at the tip of the boat. Suddenly, the pen falls over. Anne is looking at the pen on his cell phone screen. Bueller smirks and quickly says, "Huh, looks like it fell? It didn't work." Anne sighs as he holds down his cell phone near the right upper side of his leg. Anne looks back up at Bueller before asking, "How much do you want?" Bueller says after thinking for a moment, "You know number 7? Anne thinks for a minute before asking, "The little boy?" Bueller nods his head slightly before responding, "Yeah, I want the amount that he owes me." Anne looks back at Bueller, who is on his right side. Anne responds after thinking for a moment, "Well, I need time. A whole lot of time to work this out." Bueller tries to ease his worries as he says, "Relax. You're still my number one friend. You can take as much time as you want." Anne then looks back at Bueller before pointing out, "Yeah, but I know you. You're kind of impatient and let's just say it. You are insane." Bueller shakes his head slightly before responding, "You're still my friend. I can make it easy for you." Bueller squeezes Anne's shoulders as Anne looks up at him before saying, "Okay, do you have some people I can use?" Bueller simply says, "You can use Lane and Guano." Anne looks behind him for a moment, then looks ahead again and asks quietly, "Do you have some better men?" Bueller looks at Anne before saying menacingly, "These are the best I have for such short notice. So, don't disappoint me, Anne." Anne says confidently, "I won't." "Good," Bueller says as he gets closer to the right side of Anne's face, while his hands are still on his shoulders. He says in a dangerously low voice, "See you around, my friend." Bueller lets go of Anne's shoulders and walks away. When Bueller is gone, Anne puts his hands on the railings to compose himself, but not to fall down on the ground. He closes his eyes while putting his head down. A song starts to play, and the song is called "Them Shoes" by Patrick Sweeney. So Andy is doomed for getting into a stupid bet to Bueller. He knew that Bueller isn't his friend anymore. He can tell by using his real name instead of the names he gives to his friends. Andy's name was Tricks to him. He's nothing but a client to him now, and Andy got nervous and scared because he knew what Bueller does if you don't pay him on time, says Anne, as he narrates his own story to Noah, without disclosing this tiny bit of information in front of her. Noah looks slightly nervous as she asks, "What does he do?" Anne is looking at Noah sitting right across from him at the table inside the booth for a moment. He then starts saying, "Huh? I think he beats him up or something." Noah asks again, "So, how come he's afraid of him?" Anne starts answering her question as he says, "Because Bueller is a terrible person." His answer is cut short as Noah suddenly asks, "So, why does Andy hang out with Bueller if he knows he's a terrible person?" Anne shrugs as he responds, "I don't know. I just heard this story on the street today." Before Noah can question anything further, the waitress arrives with their drinks, as she says, "Here you go." The waitress puts their drinks on a kosher at their table and asks, "Are you two ready to order?" Anne immediately looks at the menu again. He then looks back up at the waitress after a moment and says, "Yes, I will take the..." Anne looks back to just confirm what he is ordering, as there are lots of varieties on the menu. He then says, "The bladder soup, please." The waitress is tapping on her tablet. When the waitress is finished tapping on her tablet, she looks at Noah, who quickly places her order, saying, "I'll take the lamb chop with steamed broccoli." The waitress is tapping on her tablet again. Once she's done, she looks up at both of them with a polite smile and says, "All right. It'll be served in a few minutes." The waitress walks away, and Anne says, "A few minutes?" Wow. Noah ignores that and asks, "So, in that story, did Annie get Bueller's money?" Anne says again, trying to narrate the story, "Bueller sent some troublemakers to Andy's place to keep a close eye on him and threaten him, while Andy was trying to get the money. Andy was whimpering and crying." Anne, Lane, and Guano are sitting near the kitchen counter at Anne's apartment while they're all busy planning something. Lane suddenly asks, "So, Anne? Motherfucker Bueller said you gotta make us all fucking rich." Lane and Guano are looking at him expectantly. Anne responds with as much sincerity as he can muster and says, "That's right. Got any ideas, gentlemen?" And my name is Trix. Lane responds to Anne. Motherfucking Bueller says to call you Anne for now on, bitch. Well, do you still got any ideas? Anne starts smiling at them. Anne starts narrating again as he says, Someone told Lane and his... Noah cuts him off midway as she asks, Who's Lane? Noah looks at Anne across the table, inside the booth that they're sitting in. Anne looks perplexed as he tries to cover up and says, Did I say Lane? I mean Lent. He's one of the troublemakers' name. Someone told Lent and his other troublemaker about a safe at a photocopy store, Anne says, but Noah stops him again with a comment. Noah says suddenly, Hey, I heard something about that yesterday. Anne is quietly sitting at the table for a moment. Then he says, I mean, an office place. Anne starts narrating the story yet again after being disturbed twice in between. Anne says, So when they told Andy about the safe, they started beating him up and made him go down on the floor, covered in blood and tears. Lent told Andy that he was going to help him steal this for him and his chump friend, and there's nothing you could do about it. Andy was crying right in front of him. The troublemakers were just laughing at him, and then they started to beat him up again. In Anne's apartment, Anne was still talking to Lane and Guano at the kitchen counter. After a while, Anne was greeting Lane and Guano at the wide-open front door. Anne patted Guano on his right shoulder when he was standing between the front door and hallway. When they were gone, Anne got a text message on his cell phone. Anne was standing behind the front door. Noah is listening to him patiently as he further says, When the troublemakers were gone, Bueller had already started to become impatient. Anne pauses for a moment, then says, The text message read, You have my money, my friend. After that, another new text appeared on the cell phone screen. That text message read, Please tell me you have it. Suddenly, there was banging coming from outside the door, and Andy got startled. So they followed their plan, and it didn't work, and now Andy is doomed, Anne tells Noah, finishing his story. After listening to the entire story, Noah asks, So what happened? Anne quietly responds, I don't know. That's how the guy ended it. The waitress arrives back at their table with their orders. She starts placing their plates on their table as she says, Here is your order. Do you need any refills for your drinks? Noah shakes her head at the waitress as an answer to her question, without really speaking anything. The waitress has Anne and Noah's order on a white plate that is placed on a tray that she is carrying. The waitress is holding it with her right hand, while with her left hand, she hands over the lamb chop to Noah's side of the table. Then she turns to the other side and hands over Anne's plate on his side. When Anne looks at the waitress, he sees Bueller standing where the waitress was standing. Bueller is looking at Anne while holding a big steaming pot on his chest. Anne looks surprised and scared. Bueller has a half smile. Finally, he pours the steaming water on top of Anne's head. Anne starts to scream out loud, while his face starts to melt away and heat up. The waitress looks confused as she says, Excuse me, sir? Anne was in a trance. Suddenly, Anne snaps out of it and looks at the waitress. He then asks, Huh, what? The waitress repeats her previous question as she says, I asked if you wanted some pepper in your soup. Anne is still looking at the waitress. After a short pause, he says, No, I'm fine, thank you. The waitress walks away. Anne's left hand grabs a spoon on his right side. He puts the spoon in the soup and tastes it. He likes the taste as he says, Good soup. He gulps the spoonful and says again, Delicious. Anne takes another spoonful while making a mess on his coat. Noah uses the fork on her right as she puts the fork in the lamb chop and tastes it. When Noah takes one bite of it, she puts the fork on her plate and picks up the napkin on her left side of the table. She cleans her mouth with the napkin. Noah looks up at Anne and says all of a sudden, Anne? Anne slurps a spoonful of his soup before responding, Yeah? Noah quietly says, I have a question. Anne asks, What is it? Noah says, About your father. Everything you said, was it the truth? Anne looks up and asks, What do you mean? Anne puts the spoon down on his right side of the table and starts smiling at Noah. She looks back at him and asks, "What did he give you the money for yesterday night?" Anne is quiet for a moment before he finally says, "I don't know, probably dirty money." Noah doesn't seem convinced as she asks again, "You sure about that?" Anne nods his head as he says, "Yeah." Noah looks at Anne and suddenly says, "I'm starting to not believe you." Anne looks hurt as he asks, "Why would you say that?" Noah responds immediately, "Because I think that the story you just told me was your own story." Anne says defensively, "I heard that today." "This story is not about me." Anne stops smiling at Noah as she says, "You freeze and get startled every time someone comes up to you." Anne shakes his head and says, "Now that's ridiculous." Anne's words cease as soon as the waitress comes back at their table. "How is everything?" the waitress asks, and Anne starts yelling. He jumps up out of his seat and looks at the waitress with a shocked expression marring his face. The waitress looks back at Anne with confusion apparent on her face. Noah looks up at the waitress and says, "Everything is fine." The waitress responds after a moment, "Okay, good." The waitress walks away while Noah looks at Anne suspiciously. Anne says, "I thought." "You thought it was Bueller?" Noah asks. Anne quickly denies as he says, "No." Noah asks again, "You made that deal with him for that stupid trick?" "No," says Anne and denies it again. Noah persistently asks again, "You know how to get his money?" Anne responds without even thinking, "No." Noah says, "That's why you were at the walk-in yesterday." Anne cuts her sentence midway and quickly says, "No." "Because you got injured at the photocopy store," Noah says. "No," Anne says again. "And now you're screwed," Noah says, shaking her head lightly. Anne responds, "No." "You know what he's going to do to you?" Noah asks. Anne is still sitting there unmoved as he says, "No." "Was that him who messed up your arm today? Bueller?" Noah asks confidently. "No," Anne says a bit louder this time. Noah takes a different approach this time as she asks, "None of the things you said about your father is true?" Anne shakes his head as he responds sincerely, "Everything I said is true. My father is a monster, a real creep." Noah is quiet for a moment. Then she looks up at Anne and says, "Is that an objective or a subjective fact?" Anne responds a bit defensively this time as he says, "Oh, it's an objective fact, all right. If you don't believe me, you can call my sister and ask her." Noah looks at him with narrowed eyes and says, "Maybe I will." "What's her number?" Anne goes quiet for a moment and is looking down at the table. He then looks back up at Noah and after a moment says, "All right, her number is 40347289094. Noah starts tapping the digits on her cell phone screen, feeding the number in, as she quickly says, "Okay, okay, okay." She pauses. Then she says in a normal voice, "Now, can you give me her real number?" Anne looks at her perplexed and says, "That is her real number." Noah gives Anne a despised look, then says, "I thought you were a kind and honest person when you tried to save me from your father, but I have realized that you're quite the opposite. You're a manipulator, a liar, and a thief. I don't know how damn made a person just has awful in the form of a son like you." Noah gets up from her seat and looks at Anne right in his eyes and says, "I hope what's coming for you will teach you some manners." Noah is about to walk away when her steps suddenly come to a halt by Anne's voice as he says, "Noah! My father was in a gang. Vaquero is still looking for him. My father was an abusive alcoholic, and he still is." Noah looks at him from behind her right shoulder and says, "I still don't believe you. Goodbye, Trix." With one last look at Anne's face, Noah walks away. Anne closes his eyes, and his head is hanging down, facing the tabletop. He clenches his teeth, and suddenly, a tear appears from his right eyes and drops down all the way to his cheekbone, jaw, and finally dispersing on the tabletop. Anne starts crying and says, "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, I fucking hate you, you motherfucker." His voice suddenly normalizes as he says, "Oh, shit. I forgot." Anne looks up and gazes all around the place. He then notices a waiter walking beside him. Anne stops him. "Excuse me?" The waiter looks at Anne with a questioning gaze. Anne quickly asks, "You have the time?" The waiter looks at his watch, then back up to Anne as he says, "Yeah, it's 7:33. Anne says to himself, "Okay, I've still got time." However, the waiter has heard him as he asks, "What?" Anne starts whimpering as he asks, "Where's the restroom? I have to clean the tears away from my face, because my girlfriend just told me that she is cheating on me with this sick old dirty pervert." The waiter gives Anne a sympathetic look and says, "I'm sorry to hear about that. The washrooms are over there." The waiter points his left hand towards the direction where the washrooms are, which are at his bottom left. Anne looks up at him and says, "Thank you." Anne stands up from his seat and looks around while walking towards the washroom door. Anne stops and holds the door firmly with his left hand. He looks around again, but he doesn't see anyone. Finally, Anne goes inside the washroom. In the washroom, the toilet stall's doors are all black. The floors have white and black tiles. The sinks are all red, and there is one closed window towards the door. Anne noticed the window and walks towards it. "What? No attendant? What a cheap place," Anne says to himself a bit loudly. He opens the window and puts his right leg on the windowpane. Anne is just about to put his head out of the window, but the washroom door starts opening. Anne immediately looks up and smiles at the person. Anne asks, "Hi? Using the restroom?" The host looks at Anne's right leg, which is placed on top of the windowpane, slightly dangling outside. He asks Anne, "What are you doing?" Anne looks up at him and says, "I'm just going to tell you the truth. I have no money with me. Sorry for leaving for outside through the washroom window." The host stares at him for a moment and says, "All right, follow me." Anne puts his leg back inside the washroom, and now he's walking behind the host. The host passes through a traffic door and enters the kitchen. The host stops at the kitchen sink and turns around to face Anne. He offers a proposition as he says, "Wash the dishes and you can leave." Anne exclaims incredulously, "Ah! Come on, with one hand." With that being said, Anne raises his left hand. The host looks at his raised hand with distaste as he says, "Would you like to talk to the police instead?" Anne sighs and says, "No." The host nods in approval and says, "All right then." The host soon leaves the kitchen, while Anne stares at all the dirty dishes he has to wash. He clearly seems annoyed. "Hey, kid," someone calls out. Anne looks at his left and sees a cook holding a frying pan in his right hand. The cook suddenly alerts him by saying, "Watch this!"